e4, King's Pawn Opening, opening line. The King's Pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the Queen and the Bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. c5, Sicilian Defense, opening line. The Sicilian defense has an ancient lineage. It creates an unbalanced position in which both sides have full rein for play, and allows Black to call the shots at least to some extent. Knight f3, Sicilian Defense, King's Knight variation, opening line. White's normal response prepares d4 and avoids such committing moves as f4 or d3 or Knight c3, which have their own rationale. d6, Sicilian Defense, Kopek variation, opening line. d4, Sicilian Defense, Kopek variation, opening line. c takes d4, Sicilian Defense, Tartakower variation, opening line. Knight takes d4, Sicilian Defense, normal variation, opening line. Knight f6, Sicilian Defense, Benko variation, opening line. The knight attack on the e4 pawn forces White to commit to its protection. Knight c3, Sicilian Defense, opening line. a6, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. Bishop e2, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. e5, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. Knight b3, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. Bishop e7, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. Castle kingside, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. Castle kingside, Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, opening line. Queen d3, out of opening book. Bishop e3 would have been in the Sicilian Defense, Najdorf variation, book opening. Bishop e6. Bishop d2. Knight c6. Knight d5. Blocks Black's pawn at d6. a5. a4. Bishop takes d5. E takes d5. Attacks Black's knight at c6. Knight b4. Moves it out of immediate danger and attacks White's queen. Bishop takes b4. Removes the threat on White's queen. A takes b4. Black wins a bishop and a knight. For a bishop and a knight, material is even. Queen b5. Forks Black's pawn at b7 and Black's pawn at b4. Rook c8. Attacks White's pawn at c2. Rook a c1. Protects White's pawn at c2. Queen d7. Protects Black's pawn at b7. Rook f d1. Queen takes b5. Removes the threat on Black's pawn at b4 and forks White's bishop and White's pawn at a4. Bishop takes b5. Removes the threat on White's pawn at a4. White wins a queen for a queen. Material is even. Rook c7. c4. B takes c3 en passant, attacks white's pawn at b2, and isolates white's pawn at d5. B takes c3, isolates black's pawn at b7. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Knight e4, c4, f5, f3, attacks black's knight. Knight c5, moves it out of immediate jeopardy, attacks white's knight, and blocks white's pawn at c4. Knight takes c5. Rook takes c5, blocks white's pawn at c4. Black wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. King f2, g6, King e2, h5, King d3, Bishop d8, Rook b1, Bishop a5, blocks white's pawn at a4. Bishop d7, attacks black's pawn at b7. Rook c7, removes the threat on black's pawn at b7 and threatens white's bishop. Bishop e6, check, moves it to safety and checks black's king. King g7, moves it out of check. c5, threatens black's pawn at d6. Rook takes c5, removes the threat on black's pawn at d6 and isolates white's pawn at d5. Rook takes b7, check, checks black's king, and creates a passed pawn on a4. White wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. King f6, moves it out of check. Rook b5. Rook c3, check, checks white's king. King d2, moves it out of check and attacks black's bishop. Rook c5, check, removes the threat on black's bishop and checks white's king with a discovered check. King d3, moves it out of check. Rook takes b5. A takes b5, pushes the passed pawn. White wins a rook for a rook. Material is even. Bishop b6, blocks white's pawn at b5. Rook a1. Rook a1. g5. h3. Rook b8. Bishop d7. g4. H takes g4, attacks black's pawn at h5 and isolates black's pawn at h5. H takes g4. F takes g4. White wins 2 pawns for a pawn. White is ahead by a pawn in material. e4, check, checks white's king and pushes the passed pawn. King e2, moves it out of check. f4. g5, check, checks black's king and pushes the passed pawn. King e5 moves it out of check and threatens white's pawn at d5. g6 advances the passed pawn. Rook g8 threatens white's pawn at g6. Rook a6 threatens black's bishop. Bishop c5 moves it to safety. b6 slightly better is king f1. Analyzing. The chessmaster recommends king to f1. You move your king to f1. Black answers with rook takes pawn. You move your rook to a8. Black responds with rook to g5. You move your bishop to c6, which protects your pawn at d5. Black responds with the pawn to f3. Your pawn takes pawn. Black answers with pawn takes pawn, which threatens checkmate. Rook to g1 and creates a passed pawn on f3. You move your rook to e8, which checks black's king. Black counters with king to f4, which moves it out of check and threatens checkmate. Rook to g1. You move your king to e1. Black responds with rook to g1, which checks your king. You are forced to move your king to d2, which moves it out of check. Black replies by moving the bishop to e3, which checks your king. You move your king to d3, which moves it out of check. Black responds with rook to d1, which checks your king. You move your king to c2, which moves it out of check and threatens black's rook. Black replies by moving rook to d2, which moves it to safety and checks your king. You move your king to c3, which moves it out of check. As a result of this line of play, the mobility of your pieces is enhanced. Additionally, your pawn structure is stronger, and black's pawn formation is disrupted. b6 slightly better is king f1. Rook takes g6. Attacks white's pawn at g2. Black wins a pawn. Material is even. Bishop h3 protects white's pawn at g2. Rook g3 blocks white's pawn at g2. b7 adds a promote threat at b7. Rook b3 attacks white's pawn at b7 and moves it behind the passed pawn at b7. Bishop c8 protects white's pawn at b7. Rook b2 checks white's king. King d1 moves it out of check. e3 pushes the passed pawn. King c1 threatens black's rook. Bishop d4 protects black's rook. Bishop g4. Rook takes b7. Removes the promote threat at b7. Black wins a pawn. Black is up a pawn. Bishop f3 removes the threat on white's pawn at d5 and blocks black's pawn at f4. Bishop c3 Rook A4. Bishop B4. King D1. King D4. King E2. Blocks Black's pawn at E3. King C3. Frees Black's bishop from the pin. Rook A1. Bishop C5. Rook C1. Check. Checks Black's king. King D4. Moves it out of check. Rook C2. Slightly better is Rook D1. Check. Diagnosing. The chessmaster suggests Rook to D1. You move your Rook to D1, which checks Black's king. Black counters with the king to E5, which moves it out of check. You move your king to D3. Black responds by moving the bishop to D4. You move your Rook to H1. Black responds by moving Rook to B3, which checks your king. You move your king to C2, which moves it out of check and attacks Black's Rook. Black counters by moving the Rook to C3, which moves it to safety and checks your king. You move your king to D1, which moves it out of check. Black answers with Rook to D3, which checks your king. You move your king to C2, which moves it out of check and attacks Black's Rook. Black responds with Rook to D2, which moves it to safety and checks your king. You move your king to B3, which moves it out of check. Black answers with King to F5. You move your king to C4. Black counters with Bishop to F6. You move your Rook to H5, which checks Black's king. Black counters with Bishop to G5, which removes the threat on Black's king. You move your Rook to H1. Improving your material or positional strength with this position is difficult. Rook C2. Slightly better is Rook D1. Check. Rook B1. Rook A2. Leads to Bishop B4. Bishop H5. Rook E1. Check. King F3. Rook F1. Check. King G4. Rook F2. Rook A4. King C5. King F5. Rook takes G2. Bishop F3. E2. Rook A1. Rook F2. Rook C1. Check. King D4. Bishop takes E2. Rook takes E2. King takes F4. King takes D5, which wins 2 pawns for a bishop and 2 pawns. Better is Bishop G4, leading to Bishop B4. Bishop C8, King E4, Rook C4, check, King E5, Rook C2, King takes D5, G3, F takes G3, King takes E3, Rook B3, check, King F4, Bishop C5, Rook D2, check, Bishop D4, which wins a pawn for 2 pawns. This was White's only meaningful error. Even though the game was within reach here, White eventually resigned. Bishop B4 threatens mate, Rook to E1. Bishop H5. Rook E1, check, checks White's king. King F3. Forced moves it out of check, threatens Black's pawn at F4, and blocks Black's pawn at F4. Rook F1 check protects Black's pawn at F4 and checks White's king. King G4 moves it out of check. Rook F2 attacks White's rook. White resigns.